Hello, welcome to lecture number 9 of the course Linguistics 2 ENG504. Now you can see in the first slide that I've written two terms, the Langue parole distinction. Now before we go to what is Langue parole, let's first look at what we did in the last class. So review of lecture number 8. We talked about anthropological linguistics, a branch of linguistics, the evolution of language, in which we talked about the evolution of language in human society and its role in the formation of culture. Then we talked about the literary stylistics, another branch which deals with analyzing literary texts, how language is used to analyze the different aspects of literary texts, their language, their sentences, their musical element, their words, and the poetic devices being used by different poets, or the linguistic devices being used by the different writers. Then we talked about the neurolinguistics, a comparatively new branch. This is the study of the neural mechanisms in the human brain that control the comprehension, production, and acquisition of language. So this deals with the thought process, or the processes going on in the brain, and how the brain controls the comprehension of sounds, the comprehension of words, and how some words are produced, and then how the language is acquired, learnt by individuals, and how in turn the language is produced by people. So this is what we talked about, what we had about some of the branches of linguistics. Now, in the first slide you saw the Langue parole distinction. Now this is one of the distinctions, of one of the fundamental distinctions given in language. Now we'll see today what it means, and we start with the fact that modern linguistics is based on some basic concepts given by linguistics in the early 20th century. Now what are these concepts? Now first of all, we see that there are two most influential groups of linguistics: the American school of structural anthropologists like Leonard Bloomfield, and then after World War we see Noam Chomsky dominating. Then we had the other group, which was a European linguist, chiefly among them the father of modern linguistics, Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. Now what was basically the concept of the modern linguistics? One of the fundamental terms was Langue parole distinction, or the competence versus performance. Now Saussure, Ferdinand de Saussure, rightly called the father of modern linguistics, he made a distinction between two aspects of language, langue and parole. What is langue and what is parole? Now langue is basically all the rules, conventions regarding the combination of sounds, how the sounds are combined, what are the basic underlying rules which govern the combination of sounds, the formation of words and sentences, the pronunciation, the meaning. All these are done under some rules. Now what are the rules basically? The rules are called the langue. That is a term which has been given by de Saussure to the conventions, the rules which govern the combination of sounds, how the sounds are combined to make the words, and how the words are combined to make the sentences, and how the pronunciation is what is the pronunciation of certain words, and what is the meaning of certain words. Now all the above conventions basically constitute langue and a product of social agreement. Now what we mean here by social agreement, that there is an society, what they agree upon those rules, they make those rules and they agree upon those rules, and then those rules they govern the combination of different sounds and words to make up the language. There is a similarity of sounds, words and meanings among the native speakers of language. That is, they have the same images and signs in their mind. So this means that the rules and the conventions or the laws which govern the combination of words or sounds, they are different in different societies. Every society agrees upon a certain rule or a set of rules which governs the combination of words or combination of sounds in order to make the language spoken in that society. Now, let's look at what Saussure says. If we embrace the sum of word image stored in the mind of all the individuals, we could identify the social bond that constitutes language. There is a social relationship. It is tightly the words, the sounds, the words, the sentences. They are tightly bound. And what is basically tying them? It's the rules. If we look at the sum of all the word images stored in the mind of all the individuals, so people have the images stored in their minds, and if we combine them, we would look at a social bond, a social relationship, a social relationship or bond, or where there are the rules, the sound images, the word images, the words, they are tied. It is a storehouse, basically, filled by members of a given community through their active use, a grammatical system that has a potential existence in each brain, and more specifically in the brains of a group of individuals. For language is not complete in any speaker, it exists perfectly only in collectivity. So it's not like a language stored in one mind is taken as the overall language of the whole society, but it's in fact a combination of different sounds or different images stored inside the brain. Then you can form up a language. Then you can decide that yes, this is a language, because so it is a combination, basically. If you look at the word again, potential existence in each brain, and more specifically in the brains of group of individuals. So it's not one brain or one individual that is responsible for a language in a society, but in fact it's the brains of the group of individuals. Different individuals might have different images, might have different sentences, might have different words stored in their mind, and that is a storehouse, basically. It's a storehouse filled by members of a given community, and that storehouse has different kinds of images and words. So then when you collect those images, when you make it a combination, then you can say that this is a language of a certain society, of a certain group of people. So proceeding on, we see langue is social, a set of conventions shared by all speakers of the language. So this is what we referred to earlier, that basically it's a set of conventions, it's a set of beliefs, it's a set of agreed upon rules which is shared by all the speakers of the language. All the speakers, they agree upon those rules, those conventions. It's a set, in fact, the set of conventions they agree upon, all the speakers living in a certain community, living in a certain country, living in a certain class, living in a certain society. They agree upon that set of conventions, and that set of conventions is basically called langue. This is the term given by Saussure. Langue is basically a combination of rules, combination of conventions. Which rules? The rules which govern the combination of rules which govern the combination of sounds, the combination of words, the combination of words to make sentences, the order in which the words should be combined to make sentences, and the order in which the sentences are combined to make larger texts. So that very rule, underlying principle, is called langue. And we see that langue is abstract. Remember, langue cannot be changed. It's an abstract, as these particular conventions exist in the minds of the speakers. You can't, it has no physical existence. You can't really experience it as a physical being. It is basically an abstract phenomenon, an abstract thing stored in the mind. The rules are stored in the minds of people, and they exist in the minds of speakers who belong to that society that has created the language. The members of that society, the language of that society is basically governed by the rules agreed upon by the speakers of that society. So what is Langue? Langue is an abstract phenomena. Langue is a set of rules. Langue is a set of principles which basically makes up the language, which basically sets the rules for forming up a language. Now, look at the next term, parole. What is parole? Parole basically belongs to individuals. When the conventions present in the human mind as langue are used in a concrete form in actual speech and writing, they become instances of parole. So when these rules, using these rules, people utter sentences, people utter sounds, people utter words. These words, these words, the speech, the writing, that is basically the parole, the production, the outcome of those rules. The outcome of those rules is the language which we see, which we can read, which we speak, and that is basically called parole. So parole is actually sounds and sentences produced by an individual speaker or writer. Whatever sounds, whatever words, sentences are spoken by speakers, or whatever language a writer writes, that language, those sounds, those words, sentences are basically parole. That is the term given by saussure. So parole is basically the concrete physical manifestation of the abstract language that exists in mind. So the abstract language is present in the mind, langue is present in the mind, the rules are present in the mind, and then the production of those rules, as a result of those rules, the language that comes out, the words, the symbols, the sounds, the sounds that come out, the sentences that come out are basically the physical manifestation, physical existence or physical outcome of those rules. That is the parole. So parole, if you see it again, parole is the concrete physical manifestation of the abstract langue that exists in mind. When we hear somebody speaking a language that we don't know, we hear the sounds in sentences. That is parole. But we cannot understand it because we don't share the conventions or langue between the individual sentences and sounds. Now this is a very important fact, that language can only be understood if you understand the langue behind it. If you share the langue, the rules, the conventions which made that language. If you hear the language which you don't understand, of course, there is a fact behind that, that you basically don't know the rules. You don't know the underlying rules that made that language. You may hear sounds, you can call them sounds, you can call them sentences, but you may not be able to understand them, you will not understand them if you don't share the langue, if you don't share the sounds, if you don't know you don't share the rules or the conventions. You can't understand it because you don't know the underlying principle. If the underlying principle is shared shared, and if you know those rules, if you know the actual conventions which created that language, only then you are able to understand that language. Now, moving on, we see that langue is the underlying system which makes the individual performance or parole meaningful. This is what I was referring to, that parole becomes meaningful only if you know the rules, only if you know the langue, only if you know the principles that made that parole. Without langue, parole would never be understood and could not serve as a means of communication. You can't expect to understand a language without knowing the basic principles which created that parole, which created that language. So you can't even use it as a means of communication. So when you communicate, you need to know how to form up the sentences, when you need to understand, if you understand parole, when you need to use parole, when you need to use it for your communication, you definitely have to know the rules. because you may sound very odd, you may sound strange if you are combining sentences, you're combining sounds and you're combining words without knowing the rules, the actual principles of joining those rules, or the actual principle, the actual conventions, the actual rules, the actual methods to combine those words. And you may be combining them in a different way or in a very strange way where you may not be understood and you may not get the desired response. So without Langue, parole would never be understood and could never serve as a means of communication. Okay, now individual performance. What is parole basically? It's individual performance of language in speech and writing. Now this varies. Parole may vary from individual to individual because performances vary. Performances of different people, they vary depending on the type of languages they are using in different contexts. So individual performance, now this is related with the individual performance. So parole is basically individual performance of language in speech and writing. It's concrete and physical. It makes use of physiological mechanisms such as speech organs in uttering words and sentences. Now when you can hear some words, you can basically physically see the mouth organs, the speech organs moving. This is where what is called the physical manifestation of the rules. So physically you can see it in concrete form, the utterance of when the words are uttered, the utterance of those words, the utterance of sounds, you can see parole. That is basically the physical manifestation of the rules behind, and you can see it in concrete and physical. Now language exists in the mind of each individual in the form of word images and knowledge of conventions as an abstract form of grammar and dictionary of the language. Langue exists in the mind of each individual. What form? The form of word images. There are images, there is a knowledge of conventions, and that is a langue. And it is an abstract form of grammar, as an abstract form of grammar and dictionary of language. So every individual, every brain has some rules, has some form of, has an abstract form of grammar, and it is that abstract form of grammar that comes out and changes into concrete form of language, concrete form of words and sentences. And this is so we can say that a form of abstract form of grammar, or the dictionary, some dictionary of language is present in the mind, and that is basically agreed upon by the speakers of that community. If that has to be used, if those rules have to be used, of course, and to be understood by other people, then they have to share the rules, they have to know those rules, they have to know those conventions in order to understand the parole and of course use the parole. Now moving on, we see that an individual makes use of the knowledge to produce actual sentences. We put it in very easy sentence, like an individual makes use of the knowledge which is stored in his mind, which is the agreed upon knowledge, the agreed upon conventions, the agreed upon rules by the different members of the society, and an individual uses those rules, uses that knowledge to do what? To produce actual sentences, which is of course called parole. Now individuals can communicate with each other because they share the same langue. How can they communicate effectively? Of course, if you share the langue, if they share the basic rules. Now sometimes you don't get the desired response, you can't communicate with each other effectively, and even if you communicate, sometimes you don't get the desired response. The reason behind is that basically the two speakers, they don't share the basic rules, they don't share the conventions, they don't share the actual base underlying knowledge that is stored in the mind. And because the mental filters are different, and there are barriers which exist because of the psychology, sometimes you call them psychological barriers. So psychological barriers are basically related with psychology, and that is the reason that the language, the abstract form of language which is in the mind, that is different. Different people have if different people have different knowledge, different langue, of course they won't be able to communicate effectively, they won't be able to understand each other's parole, and they won't be able to communicate effectively. Individuals produce different sentences based on the same lang. So this is what we mean by parole related to individuals. So parole is different with individuals because individuals, they speak different words, different sentences. Even inside one society, individuals might have different words or different varieties of language, but actually they are understood in the same society if the actual rules are agreed upon, if the actual rules are understood by all the members of the community or a society. And that is where parole can be understood and parole can be used to communicate effectively. Now, parole is basically marked as being variable, unpredictable, heterogeneous, inventive, and whimsical. Now, all these different terms basically revolve around one thing, that parole is basically can change. Parole can change. You might find different sentences, different kinds of language with different people. So parole is different, parole can be different, parole is variable, parole can vary because individuals, they speak different languages, they speak different words, they speak different sentences in different contexts, because you can't expect everybody to be in the same context, living in the same context or talking in the same context. So when they face with different contexts, and here I would also like to relate it with different classes of society and also different professions. So depending on the professions, people use different parole, people use different sentences, people use different kinds of different types of languages. And also in different classes of society, the low class, middle class, high class, and fashionable class, and the normal class, the people who are not less educated or people who are more educated, you expect, you definitely hear different kinds of languages, different kinds of words being spoken by people living in different classes. So it's here that they are, you can find different but they all understand each other only if they share the same lang. Living in the same society, they share the same lang, no matter people are using different languages, people are using different kinds of words or sentences, no matter they are using different kinds of sentences, but still they are understood because they share the same rules, they share the same set of rules, they share the same set of conventions. In simple words, they share the same lang. Still, it has to follow a stable convention of lang if it has to communicate. Parole may be different, parole may vary, but still it has to follow a stable conventions of lang if it has to communicate. If you need to communicate, you have to follow the rules basically. You may communicate in a different language. A driver may talk in a different language. A teacher may talk in a different language. A carpenter will talk in a different language. But if he needs to the listener to understand his or her language, the person has to follow the same rules, has to follow the stable conventions. So parole, no matter it varies, but still follows the same rules. So language system is basically lang, and language behavior is parole. It's an abstract system. The conventions are tied tightly for lang, but behavior is different and parole is different. Parole is related with behavior. Since behaviors are different, you expect different behaviors in different classes of society, so you expect different parole basically, because parole can vary, but still if parole has to be effective, if the words have to be effective, if the words have to be communicated, then they have to follow the same set of rules, the same lang. Saussure in 1916, we see a quote from Saussure, considering lang as a legislative side of language. He considered lang as the legislative side. This means like law. Lang is law. Lang maintains social order and homogeneity of language. Language is homogeneous in lang. It's relatively fixed, doesn't change with each individual. So the rules are same. with each individual. Langue is same. Langue doesn't change. Langue is homogeneous. This means that langue is doing the job of law. Langue is like a law. That is what Saussure meant by saying legislative side of language. On the other side, parole, he says, is the executive side of the language. It uses the law or code of language for its individual ends. So executive, execute. The law is executed. Langue is executed to make parole. Law is used in the fixed conventions. Law doesn't change. You know that law is equal for everybody. So langue is equal for everybody in the same class. And law, it's a langue that gives rise to, gives birth or rise to parole. And the parole can vary, but they all will fall under the same code, the same set of rules given by langue. Now, parole executes langue through individual acts of speaking and writing. Now, here we come on to another useful comparison between langue and parole, the analogy of game of chess. So we can compare it with a game of chess. Rules are determined and understood by all the players. The players, they know the rules of chess. They will only play with each other. The two players will only play with each other if they know the rules of chess. So they understand the rules of chess, but each game is different. You expect different kind of game, you expect different, we see different kinds of results coming out of each game. So game can be different. It depends on the individual performance. All the individuals are not the same kind of players of chess. Their competence is different. Their skill is different, their thoughts are different. So they may use different thoughts, different skills, different competencies to play that game. So the game may vary, but actually the rules will never change. The rules will never change for the chess. The rules will be the same, but you can expect different games coming out of different people or being played by different people. They would differ from player to player because players have their own skills. Individuals, they have their own thoughts. Individuals, they have their own mental skills. So that is why we can expect different games obeying the same rules of chess. Now, Saussure said only langue can be studied, not parole. Now, you can't expect to study parole because parole is different. It's difficult to study individual paroles or individual languages because there are so many different kinds of languages being spoken in the same community. The language may vary from individual to individual, so it's difficult to study. But langue, since it is same, the rules are the same, so that can be studied. Langue is a well-defined homogeneous object distinct from heterogeneous unpredictable mass of speech X. Now, what is the unpredictable mass of speech? This is the parole, because it is heterogeneous. It is it changes from individual to individual. So it's difficult to study parole, but langue is a well-defined homogeneous object. It's abstract, but it's well-defined because it doesn't change. It is distinct. It is distinct with different societies. One society has one langue. It may change in another class of society. It may change in another country, may change in another society. But in one society, one class, you can't expect langue to be changed. So langue has a very well-defined, homogeneous object. It has well-defined boundaries. It has well-defined rules and principles. So langue has signs which bear signs of collective approval. All right. Now, collective approval, the signs which have been agreed upon by different people of the same class, different people of the side. If they have approved those rules, they have collectively approved those rules, that is agreed upon the set of rules, and those signs, they belong to langue. So the signs are not different, the signs have the same collective homogeneity. Now, they exist in psychological associations having their seat in brain. They are present in the associations, psychological associations, like the relationship between psychology, relationship between the thoughts, different thoughts, but they have their seat in brain, different associations, different relationships present in brain. They have that Langue, and they have those signs which in relationship which don't change, which are agreed upon, all the thoughts, they have the same kinds of signs, they have the same kinds of Langue. Now, signs can be converted into conventional written symbols, and they can be studied because they are not different, they are the same, they are homogeneous, they are uniform. So signs, the permanent signs can be converted into conventional written symbols, and they can be studied. If you convert the signs to symbol, it becomes, of course, again the conventional symbol, which is agreed upon symbol. Then you can study the signs even. Individual acts of speaking cannot be accurately represented. They are variable, so they can't be studied. The thing which we just referred to, that since the parole is variable, it is, they are individual acts. The individual acts are different. They can't be accurately represented because they are coming from different filters. They are coming from different people, different individuals. So it's difficult to control them. It's difficult to collect them and study them because they are variable. Whereas Langue and not parole is then we see that Langue and not parole is a fit object of study. So what is the fit object? What is the suitable to study? It's Langue, not parole, because Langue is fixed. Langue has a structure. Langue has well-defined physical boundaries, so it's easy to study Langue. And since parole is not uniform, parole has heterogeneous structure, parole has different, it doesn't have definite boundaries. Parole is, you say, it's like, it's individual. Parole is individual act of speaking. In a society, in a class, you find different paroles, so it's difficult to collect them, study them, and analyze them. Now, coming on to another similar relationship, like Noam Chomsky, an American linguist, made similar distinction between competence and performance. We have two different terms, right? They are being compared with the same relationship between Langue and parole. Now, this is a similar distinction between competence and performance. Now, what is competence? Competence is the native speaker's knowledge of his language, the mastery of the system of the rules. So competence is the ability. Competence is the skill of a speaker, and that is the knowledge of a speaker about the language, his mastery or his awareness of the system of rules. And what is performance? Performance is how the person performs the production of actual sentences in use in real life situations. What type of language comes out of the situations? What kind of language comes from a speaker? That is a performance. How a person performs, how a person shows performance in different situations, whereas competence is his ability. Competence is a skill that he has or the knowledge of his language. Now, moving on to what is basically competence and how they are related to each other, we see that speaker's knowledge of the structure of language is a speaker's or the linguist's competence. And the way a speaker uses it, his linguistic performance, that is his linguistic performance. The performance depends on the competence. Whatever the person whatever abilities the person has, those abilities, they come out in the form of performance. It's a set of principles. Competence is a set of principles, the set of rules. Now remember Langue, the set of rules. Coming back, performance. We're going to compare this relationship with the relationship we just had between the Langue and parole. Now, performance is what a speaker does. In simple words, how the speaker performs. That is the performance. Competence is a kind of code, the rule, the set of rules, and performance is the act of encoding or decoding. How a person encodes that rule, encodes those rules, and performs what language a person speaks after encoding or decoding certain rules, that is the performance of a speaker. The abstract of the internal grammar, which enables a speaker to utter and understand an infinite number of potential utterances, is a speaker's competence. So abstract and the internal grammar. Remember the grammar stored. Remember Langue. The abstract, the phenomena stored in the mind, is that is the phenomena which enables a speaker to utter and understand an infinite number of potential utterances, which is the speaker's performance. That is the competence. The abstract or the internal grammar which makes a person speak, which makes a person utter sounds, which makes a person utter words, sentences, combine them and give meaningful shape, that underlying code, the underlying grammar is basically the competence of a person. Competence is free from interference due to slips of memory, lapses of attention. It is free, it is fixed. It is not affected by interferences due to slips of memory. Competence doesn't change. A person who has a certain level of competence would never change. Would never improve the competence, because competence is the ability to understand the underlying code. The code doesn't change. The set of rules doesn't change. So what is performance? It can change. Performance shows many such lapses. Performance can be different. In a match, a cricket match, different cricket matches or different football matches, you expect the performance to change. Players have different performances. Players may show different performances depending on the situation, depending on their practice. Without practice, a person out of practice would not show performance. But the competence never changes. A person who's competent can perform depending on his practice, depending on the training. A footballer might perform very well, but in one match, but in the next match may not perform very well because the situation was different, because maybe the person was not well, maybe the footballer was out of practice, or maybe the other team players, they marked him and they could not make him perform well. The other players, they stopped him from performing well. So performance can vary depending on situations. Performance can vary depending on the physical situation of a person, but the competence doesn't change. A person who is competent to an extent will be competent, and the level of competence doesn't change. Competence is free from interference due to slips of memory. It is free, it doesn't change. Whereas performance can change. Competence is ideal as it gives us coherent picture of the language. We see that it's difficult to keep a direct coherent record of performance. We can't keep the record of performances direct coherent record because the record will change. Since performances change and performance is different in different situations, so it's difficult to keep a similar record. The record changes. You can't expect to have the same record of a variable thing. Since performance is variable, performance changes, so you can't have a fixed record. You will have a variable changing record. Competence versus performance basically resembles Langue and Parole, but different in one respect. Now, you see that it's the same relationship. So far, we have seen that Langue and Parole, the relationship between Langue and Parole is almost similar to the relationship between competence and performance. But here we have a differing point, a point which maybe differentiates both. Now, let's see how these two differ. What is the point that differentiates both? they are similar, the relationship looks similar, but again here if there is a point that differentiates both, that is a point, there is an aspect where these two relationships are different. Lang is the same with every lang user, but competence may be different from user to user. So lang doesn't change. Lang is the same set, the same code of rules which doesn't change. But competence, we know that it changes. Different people have different competence. You have incompetent people, you have competent people in different fields, and competence may be different from user. The ability, the skill, the awareness, the capability of a person might be different. It varies from person to person. So Lang basically emphasizes social aspect while competence deals with the psychology. Now here is that point which differentiates both, that Lang basically emphasizes the social aspect. How the rules are set and how those rules are used to produce parole, which is different in different situations. But competence basically deals with psychology. Speaker A may be more competent than speaker B, though they may share the same conventions of the language. So the conventions are the same, Lang is the same, but one is more competent, the other may not be that competent. So competence basically is different, can differ from person to person, but not Lang. As performance would also be different from A's performance would also be different from that of B. So here we see that both these things can be different. The competence can be different, and again naturally we've already talked about it, that the performance can be different. So it's competence and performance, basically the relationship is similar to the Lang and Parole, but the point where they differ, the relationships differ, is the point where we see that the level of competence. From the aspect of the level of competence, aspect of the level of competence, we see that competence can be different with different people, but not Lang. Lang is the same, is a set of rules which is same with different people. Chomsky's view of competence is also based on the idea that an inbuilt language acquisition device in humans that makes human acquire competence. There is an inbuilt language acquisition device in humans that makes human acquire competence. Now, Chomsky says that competence is based on the idea of an inbuilt language acquisition device. There is an inbuilt language acquiring device, or a device which helps which helps an individual to acquire language, that basically is a base to the competence. So people's competence depends on the device. People's competence is according to that device. Which device? The language acquisition device. The device which helps a person to acquire language. So every person, you can't expect every learner to learn language with the same speed, to learn language with the same efficiency. You need some more time for some speakers, you need more drills for some speakers, you need a different kind of strategy to teach different students, different learners. You may have to change your strategy, you may have to change your time, you may have to give more time to the learners. So that is where the language, the inbuilt language acquisition device comes into picture, because the language inbuilt device is different with different people, and that is the reason why competence varies, because it's the language acquisition device that gives rise. That is basically, if you see the point, the language acquisition device in humans, that makes human acquire competence. So whatever competence I'm getting, or whatever competence I have, basically also depends what competence of language, that also depends on my language acquisition device, and that device is stored in my mind. So that device, the capability of that device basically gives rise to the to the level of competence I have, or the level of confidence I can get. So in recent years there has been some argument about these distinctions. No, an argument comes up when we talk about the learning acquisition device or the relationship between Langue and Parole and the competence and performance. Now let's look at what is the difference, what is the argument that about these relationships. Now some social linguistics regard these dichotomies as unreal. They say that Langue and Parole are interrelated and not separate. Just as Parole is not possible or effective without Langue, Langue also changes gradually under the effect of Parole. So they are interrelated. They are not separate. They have a relationship with each other. So just as Parole is not possible without Langue, you have to have Langue for producing Parole. In the same way, Langue also changes gradually under the effect of Parole. Now here is a new point here. We said that Parole is permanent, Parole is fixed, Parole doesn't change. But here we have a new argument where they say that Langue sometimes changes under the influence of Parole. And the way Parole changes, the way there are more words entering in Parole, more structures entering Parole, in the same way the rules are also sometimes changing. We see some of the grammar rules in the modern era. Some of the grammar rules they have acquired some changes. They have some of the rules have changes under the. Now why these rules have changed? This could be because the Parole is changing, because under the powerful influence of Parole, because what on the surface we see is Parole. Parole is what is a concrete entity, and we see Parole as dominant. So under the influence of Parole, the rules sometimes are ignored, maybe, or maybe they are overlooked or they are changed. So this is a new argument that Parole may change, Langue may change under the influence of Parole. Saussure said, speech has both an individual and a social size, and we cannot conceive of one without the other. Speech can only be judged if we look at both the aspects, individual and social, because speech is undergoing changes inside the mind and speech is undergoing changes outside the mind. So it has two aspects. Speech has two aspects, inner and outer, and we cannot talk about speech, we cannot give decisions about the change in language, we cannot analyze the language unless we look at the inner aspect and the outer aspect both. So Saussure says speech has an individual because it is changing individually. It is the way we have the example of Langue and also competence. So competence can vary depending on the language acquisition device. Langue here, under the new argument, we see that Langue can change under the influence of Parole. So Saussure says speech has basically two aspects, and these two aspects have to be studied, the inner aspect and the outer aspect, and we cannot conceive one without the other. We can't imagine Parole, we can't imagine inner aspect without the outer aspect, and we can't study or analyze the outer aspect without looking at the psychology or the inner aspect of the language. Now, social linguistics also object that Parole can also be studied as it is concerned with the use of language in social situations, which have an effect on Langue. Now here we have a new idea. We first said that Parole can't be studied because it's different. It's difficult to study the variations in the use of Parole, the changes in the use of Parole. You can't collect all those changes, you can't study. But here we have a new argument. We say that social linguistics, they say that Parole can also be studied as it is concerned with the use of language in social situations, which have an effect on Langue. So social situations may have effect on Langue, they can have effect on the Langue, they can have the effect on the rules. So rules can be modified, rules can be changed. Here, this point, looking at this point, we see that rules can be changed looking at the social situations. So social situations might make a person, might make linguists modify the rules. Sometimes the learners, the users, the speakers, the writers, they modify sometimes the rules looking at the situation, so they overlook the rules. So this means that parole can also be studied, because parole is you use parole in different different parole in different social situations. So it is concerned, as it is concerned with the use of language. Now look at the sentence that it's concerned with the use of language in social situations which have an effect on language. Since social situations have an effect on lang, so, and parole is used in those social situations, so we can also study parole. How? Because it is related with society, and the social situations, they have an effect on lang, so indirectly we establish a relationship that parole can also be studied. We cannot keep parole or the performance out of our study of language, because it also guides us into language processes. You can't keep performance out of your picture. If you study the performance, you go back to the competence, you go back to the lang. So this guides us to the language process. How? The rules, what were those rules which gave birth to parole? What were those rules which governed the production of certain parole? And what was those rules which gave, what was that level of competence that gave birth to a certain performance, or that gave us a certain performance, or that governed a certain performance? So when we study one thing, when we study performance, basically we can also get insight into competence, or when we study parole, we get an insight of the lang. So this means performance can be studied because it guides us. We can't keep parole or performance out of study of language. If we are studying lang, if we are studying the rules, then we must study what is coming out of those rules. If we study what is coming out of those rules, through it can give us, through this study, it can give us an insight into the set of rules, into the basically the principles that gave that gave us the parole, or that gave us that performance, that set of words, that vocabulary, those sentences, sounds, which are, of course, broadly speaking, the parole. So parole has to be studied. Parole, we can't keep it out of the picture. We can't just stick to only rules and ignore what is coming out of those rules. Parole also has some features which are systematic and predictable in given social situations. Now here we see that in different social situations we have a certain fixed kind of vocabulary, we have a certain fixed kind of language, and that is only that language or that vocabulary or those sentences are used in certain social situations. You can't expect to use different language, because that would be considered misfit according to the social situations. That would be considered inappropriate according to the social situations. So this means that parole also has some features which are systematic. Parole also enjoys a system, because there is a fixed kind of vocabulary, there is a fixed kind of parole which is used in different social situations. The vocabulary, the language you are using in one social situations may not be effective in another social situations. So this means that yes, parole also enjoys a system, parole also enjoys some fixed rules, and you have to stick those rules in order to use the parole, or in order to use it in different situations. Now, moreover, it's not easier to study performance through recording by audio-video devices. Study of parole gives us data that makes us understand lang and competence better. It's not easy to study the performance through recording by audio and video devices, because on audio and video devices, again, sometimes you can expect a speaker to speak certain kind of vocabulary, to speak certain kinds of words or sentences under a different mental situation. When you are listening to audio or video devices, a person is working in a particular environment. A person is working in one fixed environment. So he or she has to use that particular vocabulary or that particular kind of language. So it's not easy really to study the performances. The performance might be better, the person might come very prepared, but sometimes when you make a speaker speak suddenly on a mic, the performance may not be that good, because the person might have been asked to go on spot and speak. So here, due to different situations, social situations, it's not easy to study the performances through recording. Now, study of parole gives us the data that makes us, when we study parole, when we have languages, when we study different kinds of vocabulary or different words and sentences, or when we study parole, that gives us a data that makes us understand Langue and competence better. We can understand Langue, we can understand the rules, the set of rules, if we study the parole. We can understand the competence better if we study the performance. Through performance, we can judge the competence of a person. Or if we monitor or monitor a performance of a person over a long period of time, we can know that how capable a person is. Sometimes a person has a certain capability and is never able to perform in a different way, always performs in the same way, and the words, the language that person use speaks of the competence, and you can definitely assess that yes, the person has a certain level of competence which doesn't improve, and that is, we normally say, that is his competence. You can't expect a better performance out of a person, because that is his competence. So through performance we can also see the competence. Now, coming on to the last part of this today's discussion, that is the Langue parole or the competence performance relationship, we see that distinction is still useful as it enables us to understand the aspects of language and to study each of them more in a more systematic manner. This distinction, the distinction between Langue and parole, the distinction between competence and performance, is still useful. Although we see arguments rising against that, we see that people say that this distinction is no more useful, because you can't keep the two things separately. They are interdependent on each other. They put effect on each other. Still, this distinction is very useful because it makes us understand the aspects of language. We study parole and we can know the Langue, and through Langue we know the set of rules. The set of rules, we can assess the language. We can see the language, what language is formed out of that set of rules. We study the performance of people and we come to know about competence. And when we study competence, we come to know that language acquiring device, the permanent device that is stored in the brain. And we can study the psychology of a person. We can study the language acquiring skill of a person. So this distinction by de Saussure, by Chomsky, they are still useful because we can study the language. We can study the language in a very systematic way because they are so interrelated, and they have a relationship, and they do have an effect on each other, and it really helps us. It really makes it possible for us to study the language in a very systematic way and know the origin of language of a certain society or the changes in language of a certain society. Now, coming on to the summing up the introduction, most linguistics based on some basic concepts given by linguists in early 20th century. And what are those concepts? We see that Saussure made a distinction between Langue and parole. Langue is a language, all the rules and conventions. Parole is a production. Parole is Langue is the abstract form, and parole is basically concrete form of language. We see the words and sentences and pronunciation and vocabulary, that is parole. And we see that Langue cannot be changed. Langue is permanent, and the parole is different. Parole is changed, it's variable, varies from individual. Langue is related with the brain, the rules, and parole is related with the individuals. Then we saw its relationship with another relationship, which is competence and performance, given by Noam Chomsky. And he said that competence is a set of principle, and performance, just like parole, is what a speaker does. Competence is a code, and performance the act of encoding or decoding. The abstract of internal grammar or the internal grammar which enables a speaker to utter and understand an infinite number of potential utterances. So infinite number of potential utterances is basically your parole, which basically your performance, and the abstract thing, the permanent thing, is the competence. Then we see that competence is free from interference, doesn't change. But then we also looked at arguments raised by social linguistics who said that lang and parole are interrelated, they have an effect on each other, they can't be changed. Just like competence and performance can't be changed, the performance tells us about competence. We need to study performance. We can't ignore parole and performance. We can't keep them out of the picture because they definitely have effect on the permanent side. They have an effect on the lang and they have an effect on the competence. Sometimes the rules are overlooked, the rules are changed under the powerful influence of the of the language being used by a certain class of society. So we have to look at the inner as well as the outer aspects. They also object that parole can't be studied as it is concerned with the use of language in social situations which have an effect on lang. So this is what is meant by the powerful effect of parole, powerful effect of the social situations on lang. The words the society uses, they are so frequently spoken that those words, they become not only conventions, they become a part of the grammar, and those words, they sometimes create and have an effect on the permanent rules of a language. So competence, concluding, we say that language can be studied very systematically if we look at these two distinctions, very important distinctions given by Ferdinand de Saussure, the Swiss linguist, the father of modern linguistics. The lang and parole, lang rules and parole, the parole, what comes out of those rules. Competence and performance, Noam Chomsky giving these distinctions. Competence, the skill, the permanent code which is in the brain, and the performance, which is what the person does, is performance. So this is all what we had about the lang and parole distinction and competence and performance distinction. In the further lectures we look at some more distinctions, some fundamental distinctions of language before moving on actually to the theories of language and further on. So that's all we have for this lecture. Thank you very much.